Could you explain to our audience how a knowledge-based curriculum is important for disadvantaged learners?
Children who lack the opportunities outside school to study well are completely dependent on the school to get access to knowledge. Now that is why a knowledge-based curriculum is what you might call an emancipatory curriculum. It is a way of equalising opportunity because it gives to all children the same kind of structured opportunities that otherwise only the children of the wealthiest and best educated parents would have had in the past. By best educated, I mean those parents who have themselves gone through university or some other expensive kind of education.
If a primary teacher wanted to become more knowledge focused tomorrow, what would be the first step you'd advise them to take?
I think the key thing is to work with colleagues. Don't try and do it on your own.
Which aspects of the current curriculum could serve as foundations for a more knowledge-based approach?
Well, in curriculum for excellence, I think the thing that is most impressive about it is
Hello and welcome to this episode where I'll be interviewing Lindsay Paterson about his research paper titled How a Knowledge-Based Curriculum Could Transform Scottish Education. Today I'll be interviewing him in Chapter 1 Cafe, a women-owned vegan coffee shop in the heart of Edinburgh on Dalry Road. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below the video. Thank you. I really hope you enjoy our first episode. Hi Lindsay, thank you so much for being our very first guest on our YouTube channel. For those who do not know Lindsay, I'm just going to give a brief introduction of your background, if that's okay. So Lindsay Paterson is an Emeritus Professor of Education Policy at the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. His main academic interests are in education, civic engagement and political attitudes. He has contributed to many debates in Scotland since the early 1990s on education, social change and politics. He is a Fellow of the British Academy and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He has written a number of books on topics within Scottish education and has carried out many research studies within this area too. I'm so grateful to have Lindsay as our very first guest on this channel. It is a true honour and I'm very appreciative of your time in speaking with us today. Today you have kindly joined us to talk specifically about your most recent paper, How a Knowledge-Based Curriculum Could Transform Scottish Education, which was published in January 2025. For teachers who may not yet have read your paper, could you briefly explain what your research focused on and how you went about it?
Well, the key thing about the curriculum is that it's about getting knowledge. It's getting children to acquire knowledge. And knowledge is quite complicated, actually. It's not just a list of facts. I mean, facts are important. We might come on to that later in our conversation. But the more important thing about knowledge is what the psychologists call schemas. Now, a schema is a structure of knowledge. So it might be better if I gave you a few examples of that from the kind of primary curriculum. Maybe one of the most obvious is a multiplication table. A multiplication table is a schema for how to handle numbers. So if we can do the 7 times multiplication table, then that gives us an understanding of how the number 7 enters into all sorts of arithmetical calculations. Another example of a schema would be the story of the past. For example, the origins of the First World War, or the story of Bonnie Prince Charlie of Mary Queen of Scots, or the story of how women got the vote in Britain in the 1920s. These are narratives because they explain individual events. And in some ways the facts around that matter not so much. So it doesn't really matter exactly when it was that certain events happened in history. It's quite important, and people should learn the dates, broadly speaking. But more important is the story, the explanation. A third example would be in science, in natural science. In the springtime, birds nest, so we have to understand why do birds make nests. So the story is about laying eggs and creating the next generation of birds. Now that's a schema, a story, the concepts that make sense of the facts. And that is what the main purpose of this research has been, is what is the most effective way of getting children to learn these schemas.
And based on that research, what is the key evidence that underpins your argument for a knowledge-based curriculum? And what do you most want primary teachers to take away from your paper?
So the key thing that comes from that is then what do teachers have to do to help young people to get these schemas, the structured knowledge into their minds. Now the key thing here is memory. The human memory is two different kinds, really. One is short-term memory, or working memory as it's sometimes called, and another is long-term memory. Now the aim is to get stuff into long-term memory so that we can summon it back again next day or next year or next decade. But the problem is that to get into long-term memory, we've got to go through short-term memory or working memory. And human working memory is really very limited. The evidence is that most of us can only hold about 5 or 6 things in our minds at any one time. And so it's very easy to get things crowded out. So basically you've got to get these important structures of knowledge into children's long-term memory so they get stuck there. But they can only do it through the short-term memory. Now the way to do that, of course, is to embed the knowledge in schemas. So basically what you're trying to get is the structure into short-term memory, like the multiplication table, and then you've got to get that lodged into long-term memory. And that's difficult. It's easy for me to trot that out as if it was simple. It's extremely difficult. That is the main challenge, is for a teacher, is to get things from short-term memory into long-term memory. Now, there's lots of other things that you can do that we know work there. For example, reinforcement. So you don't just give a child the one opportunity to learn something, you do it over and over again. It turns out also that one way to embed things, to entrench things in long-term memory, is to encourage students to recall it. So recalling things from memory actually helps to make it stronger within our memories. And it even turns out that a better way of entrenching things in long-term memory is to temporarily forget it. One of the reasons for that is a thing that we probably all know. If you have a problem and you can't solve it, sleep on it, literally sleep on it. Think about it before you go to bed at night, and in the morning, hey presto, sometimes your mind has sorted it out. And that's because it's been working away there in the background. So if you can get children, so you might get them to be focusing one part of the day, multiplication tables. Well, don't spend the whole day on multiplication tables. I mean, every teacher knows this anyway, but don't do that, because it's not just boring, it's actually not very effective as a form of learning. Move on to something else, some other area like history or whatever, but then something completely different like music or PE. And that actually allows the children's memories to be disengaged from the multiplication tables, and it actually means that the mind is better able to absorb the multiplication table, so the next day when you come back to the tables, they will better remember it than they would have done if you'd spent the whole day on multiplication tables. So that's a key task. But the main thing, and so all of these things are tasks for teachers, and all of these things are extremely difficult. And I think people who don't recognise the sheer difficulty of teachers are really doing teachers a disservice. I mean, teaching is an extremely difficult job because of this need to do that thing via short-term memory into long-term memory of difficult ideas. That's what teaching is. Now, the most important thing here is teachers' own expertise. So if you give me a subject that I don't know anything about, a good example might be for me is PE, physical sport. I don't know anything about it. I don't participate in it much. I watch it maybe, but I don't even do that very much. So I could easily, you give me a list of things that children are supposed to learn, and I could read them out, and it would be a completely useless lesson. Nobody would learn a single thing from that. And the person best equipped to teach PE is, of course, somebody who themselves has expertise in sport, in some aspect of sport, and along with that would be expertise in the physiology of the body, of what practice is appropriate for that particular sport, of what the rules of the competitive sport are, if that's the kind of sport it is, how to encourage, if this is appropriate, how to encourage young people to work as a team, if it's a team sport. Now, all of that requires expert knowledge of that sport. Similarly, to teach maths, you've got to be an expert in maths. To teach language, you've got to be an expert in language. To teach geography, you've got to be an expert in geography and the diversity of world cultures and so on. So in other words, teacher expertise, if you ask where do the schemas come from that are the thing that goes into short-term memory, from short-term memory into long-term, where do the schemas come from? They come out of the teacher's head, because it's got to be a piece of structured knowledge that's in the teacher's head. So that's why not only do teachers have to understand about human memory and about how practice can get things into long-term memory, teachers have also got to have expert knowledge of the substance of the curriculum. It's not enough just to say teachers have to know about pedagogy. They've also got to know about the stuff that is in the curriculum as well. So you've got to be an expert in the knowledge and also an expert in how to teach the knowledge. In other words, two jobs at the same time, which makes it even more difficult, actually.
Your paper argues that knowledge underpins skills. What does this look like in a day-to-day teaching scenario?
Well, my colleague Bruce Robertson has a wonderful phrase here that skills are knowledge in action. And I think knowledge in action is a great way of summing up what skills are. So skills require knowledge. If you're going to be a good plumber or a good astrophysicist, you've got to have knowledge. You've got to have knowledge of the way the world works, the knowledge of how you work in relation to the world. Usually you've got to also have knowledge of a team of other human beings working on the same problem. So knowledge is crucial to skills, but skills are about the application of knowledge. So that requires a lot of knowledge about things that are not directly what you appear to need to know. So for example, if you want to create young people who are skilled at using biological knowledge to understand a local park, for example, there's a whole lot of different kinds of knowledge they would have to have. Yes, there's the straightforward biological knowledge about the plants that grow there, but it's not just plants, of course, it's animals, but it's also how all these things, the plants and all the different kinds of animals, interact with each other. And then it's about how human beings impinge on the park and how other animals that human beings have, like dogs and cats, how they impinge on the park. You've got to understand about the pattern of leisure activities that people in that area of the city or wherever might have. I mean, all of these things require broad interdisciplinary or cross-curricular knowledge. So skills are even more dependent on cross-curricular knowledge, but they all depend on knowledge. So that means that when teachers are thinking about how to enhance young people's skills, they've actually got to first of all think about what knowledge is it that underpins this area of skill that we're talking about. Let me give you a completely different example. Say cookery skills. Now cooking really is one of the most interdisciplinary things we can think about. There's an interaction between the science of physics, transfer of heat and so on from one thing to another, from the cooker to the pot. But there's also chemistry, which is the interaction of the different ingredients in making a cake, for example, which is kind of almost like a miraculous transformation if seen through a child's eyes. There's an understanding of safety and health and so on. But then, of course, step back from that, there's also an understanding of human culture, because most of the stuff we eat comes from a great variety of cultures. So you've got to understand the cultures of all the major food regions of the world, whether that's Europe or the Mediterranean or India or China or North America. These are forms of cultural knowledge which are necessary in order to understand what goes into the ingredients for this particular dish. Now that may seem miles removed from how you would teach a cookery lesson, but nevertheless, if you really want the young person to understand the making of a particular dish, they really should be learning all of these things: physics, chemistry, organizational skills, and also cultural knowledge. So that is the key thing about skills, is that they are multidisciplinary, they are cross-curricular, but they depend on knowledge really very strongly indeed.
As we are aware, there are many large changes in education policy and practice, which adds stress to teachers. With the view of trying to protect a teacher's mental health, work-life balance, and general respect for their current teaching practices, which aspects of the current curriculum are already working well and could serve as foundations for a more knowledge-based approach?
Well, in curriculum for excellence, I think the thing that is most impressive about it is the emphasis on cross-curricular skills. So that is really important. And although I'll be critical of that in a moment, perhaps, I think it's a really important thing. It didn't used to be the case in this primary school curriculum, and it's not the case in other countries in the world, or some other countries in the world. But in Scotland, there has been very strong and very welcome encouragement of cross-curricular skills. So sometimes they're called project-based, or sometimes they're called interdisciplinary, but I think cross-curricular is the closest thing we've got. So I think many teachers have put lots of very valuable work into creating good projects, cross-curricular projects, in which children learn lots and lots of things. So that's going well, and absolutely should not be ditched. It should be built upon. But, and this is the but, the problem is that a cross-curricular project only works as an educational project if the children are prepared for the knowledge that has to go into it. So let me go back to the example of investigating a local park. And in Edinburgh, actually, I take an Edinburgh example because there's some lovely parks beside the canal. So it's not just the greenery of the park, it's also the water. But the same would apply if you're going to a rural area with rivers in it or near the seaside or whatever. So there's an interaction of different environments. So let's think about the things that need to happen before the children can learn things from going to the park. They need to know about the ecology of the park, which is both plants and animals. And the animals are both big animals, obvious ones like pets, for example, or rodents such as rats and mice and voles and so on, and the birds, which are very visible, but also tiny things, the microbes, the insects that fly as well as those that don't. These are all crucial to the ecology of the park because these form the food. They're part of the bottom end of the food chain for the birds, for example, and other mammals, as well as the birds. Now, for the child to even begin to understand what to observe in the form of the bird life of the park and how that bird life depends on the general environmental health of the park, they have to understand something about the life cycle of birds and the concept of the food chain going from the smallest food to the largest predators. And if we take a park also that is adjacent to water, such as the canal in Edinburgh, you then have to say something about the history, because the canal originally 200 years ago was an industrial enterprise. So that canal used to be so polluted there was hardly any wildlife in it at all. And around about the turn of this century, there was a big project funded as part of the millennial changes where the canal all the way from Edinburgh to Falkirk was renovated, was cleaned up, and it's now possible to travel all the way on either by boat or indeed walking or cycling on the footpath all the way from Edinburgh right through to Falkirk. Now that is a transformation that needs us to understand about industrial history, about how industrial history both produced a lot of wealth but also produced a lot of pollution. It also requires us, therefore, more recently to understand the legacies of that pollution, why it was that policymakers about 25 to 30 years ago decided to do something about that and create a very pleasant leisure space. But it also then requires us to understand something about people's changing patterns of leisure. Because if you're going to observe the animals in the park and the canal, one of these animals is human beings. And human beings have a good as well as a bad impact on nice spaces like that. So again, if you sent a child into the park, of any age, or indeed any of us, an adult as well, but if you sent a child into the park, they wouldn't, without background knowledge, wouldn't spontaneously observe everything that I've been saying. So where does that come from? Well, what it means is the teacher, first of all, has to prepare the children for this cross-curricular project. Now, I don't mean hours and hours of boring lectures, but there has to be some preliminary explanation, what to look for, and maybe to some extent also how to look for it. Note paper, taking photographs on their cameras or some other device, that kind of thing. No more than 10 or 15 minutes. I mean, that's the key thing. It's not to be boring, it's got to be an exciting preparation for going outside the school. But then the teacher has to keep coming back to that. Some mini lectures. Let's suppose a child finds spots of vole. Voles are quite secretive. So that's a real opportunity for the teacher to get the children together and say, why is the vole there? Where's its hole? What's its hiding from? What are the predators of voles? How do they survive given that there's lots of predators around? And what do they in turn eat? What grubs and small insects do they eat? Why do they live in the water? All that kind of thing, or near the water if it's a water vole. Now that might be an impromptu mini lecture, 5 minutes of lecture or something in the park itself. But then go back to the classroom. You've got all this evidence assembled by the children about the plants and animals and human beings and the interactions. They've got to assemble that into some sort of coherent narrative. And that means the teacher has to come back in again. Now, all of this goes back to the beginning here, which is this concept of schemas, the schema of the plants, the schema of the animals, the schema of the interaction between both of these and the human beings. These are structures of knowledge. And the teacher has to get these structures into the preparation for the fieldwork, into the supervision of the fieldwork when the children are out there, and into the recapping, the retrospective reflection on what the children should have learned, what the takeaways are, what are they going to remember, or what should they remember from the time they spent there. And what they should be remembering should be crucial schemas, crucial structures of knowledge. They will, of course, remember other things. They will They might, I don't know, observe a dog running away from its owner. That probably will not tell us an enormous amount about the ecology of the park. It might do, but it probably won't. But it might be very memorable because it might be quite a sudden, almost shocking event to happen. But you want to make sure that as well as remembering these things, which the children will naturally do, they've also got to remember scientifically generalisable things above all.
If a primary teacher wanted to become more knowledge-focused tomorrow, what would be the first small, realistic step you'd advise them to take?
I think the key thing is to work with colleagues. Don't try and do it on your own. Nobody can do it, especially in primary school. The primary teachers have to be in command of the whole range of things that are in the curriculum, and that is something that nobody can do on their own. So the key thing is, of course, to work with colleagues, first of all in your own school, but if possible, actually other schools, neighbouring schools. Probably easiest thing to do is in your own cluster, but it could well be, especially through social media, working with teachers in other schools, even outside Scotland perhaps. Anyway, we might come back to that too, but the thing here is to work with other people. Now, what are you going to be working on? Well, the thing is to unpack the very general and very vague statements in the E's and O's into step-by-step approaches to this kind of thing. Now, it's step-by-step in two senses. One is for a given level, say primary 7. What is it, if you're going to get them to understand the ecology of the local neighbourhood, what are the steps that have to be taken from the preliminary briefing on them and what to look out for when they go to the park, through what they would observe in the park, what kind of recording instruments they would use, which might be notebooks or notepads, electronic notepads or cameras or whatever, through all of that, through to how to make sure that what they've learnt remains in their memory after they've come back to the classroom. Now, these are things that should be spelt out in detail as steps. And actually, oddly enough, the more, it's almost like you need the steps to be quite rigid. You may fear that this sounds very dry, but it won't be. You will create the opportunities for the children, opportunities that will be exciting for the children, but the key thing for you as a teacher is to make sure that all the boxes are ticked. Now that's, and I say, if you do it with colleagues, then they will be thinking along the same lines. So that's one set of steps for a given age. But there's also, of course, the steps involved in children becoming older. So the primary 1 going to the park will not be doing the same kind of things as the primary 7, but you would want them to be doing things that would help them to get to the primary 7 stage. For example, at primary 1 or primary 2 in the early years, you would want them to be getting used to the idea of careful observation, that it's not enough just to look out in the park and run around and just happen to observe things. You've got to begin to establish the idea that science means systematic observation, and becoming systematic about that is a possible first step for children aged 6 or 7, even though to do too much of that is going to be very boring for them. Similarly, let's change the subject completely. Let's talk about some aspect of history. And let us suppose that you're wanting children to engage with the, let's say, the story of migration to Scotland over the centuries. Now, that's a very complex thing, and you don't want to dump the whole thing on children all at once. Even primary 7, it's way beyond them. But on the other hand, you do want them to start to engage with that, because you can't leave that to secondary stage. It's got to be something that happens in primary. So let's again start with primary 1, primary 2. Well, yeah, the chances are now in Scotland that the class itself will be quite multicultural, the neighbourhoods will be quite multicultural, but in any case, even if they're not, they will see on television and through social media that Scotland's a much more multicultural place than it used to be in the past. So you start with things that they are within the children's own direct experience. And for young children, that is far and away the best way of encouraging that. But of course, it's not enough, because they will have to learn, if they're going to learn about Scotland's cultural diversity, they will have to learn about things that are not within their direct experience. For example, religious cultures or other cultures that are not present in their school. Or more negatively, racism that is present in other parts of Scotland but is not present in their school because everybody there is of a white skin colour. Now, by the time you get to primary 7, you would certainly want children to start to engage with these more difficult, controversial, sometimes quite awkward topics. So again, the thing is to do it step by step, to work with them. What is it that Scotland is now? Where have the cultures that are not traditionally part of Scottish culture come from? Why have they come to Scotland rather than, let us say, to Germany or North America? Why are these cultures and there are people that carry these cultures? But also what happened in the past. Scotland has been multicultural in different ways in the past. For example, migration to Scotland from Ireland in the 19th century, bringing large elements of Catholic settlement, migration to Scotland from Central Europe in the middle of the 19th to the middle of the 20th century, bringing Jewish culture, for example, or Polish culture to Scotland. These are things which show that actually migration is not something that's only happened in the last 20 years, but it's something that has been going on certainly for several centuries at least. Now, all of these things require the same kind of detailed planning. They are all about knowledge, about the place of Scotland in the world, the place of the people coming to Scotland in the world. Probably by primary 7, you also want to talk about emigration, people moving from Scotland to other parts of the world. The Scots are the immigrants, and the other populations are the receivers. You'd want to talk about all these things, but the point is you want to do it in a way that goes step by step from the experience that children can see in the world around them, when we're talking about young children, to a more conceptual kind of understanding for the older ages. And by the time you get to primary 6, primary 7, young people are in a position to start understanding ideas about different religions, for example, different forms of culture, not just in the formal things like religion, but also in the forms of food, for example, or sporting activities and so on. They begin to understand something about Scotland and Britain's place in the world, about the British Empire and its legacies still affecting our societies today. All of these things, I think, you can't just spring on people, you can't just bring in without step-by-step progression. And it is always better, when talking about these things, to start from children's direct experience. But it's always really important to get beyond their direct experience. Sometimes we hear these controversies about, seem like polar opposites. We only talked about the lived experience of children, or we only talk about abstract concepts. Well, actually, you need both. You need to start from lived experience, but then get beyond. And of course, one of the ways of getting beyond, still on the theme of history, is imaginative literature, novels, poems, films, plays. Robert Burns' old phrase, to see ourselves as others see us. So if you read a novel about the experience of people migrating from Scotland to other places, or migrating from other places to Scotland, then even if you as a child are not yourself in a migrant family, you nevertheless will begin to get an imaginative insight into what it feels like to be moving into a completely different culture from the one in which you used to know. So all of these are, again, this requires careful planning, step-by-step detailed things. There are lots of grand statements in the E's and O's about the necessity of this kind of thing, but there isn't the detail. It requires the kind of planning that we've just been talking about.
When reading your paper, I was really struck by one of your points, sharing the importance of a knowledge-based curriculum in regard to reducing the socio-economic gaps. Could you explain this to our audience, particularly about how a knowledge-based curriculum is important for disadvantaged learners?
Well, this is where, the crucial importance of the teacher comes in. This is through no fault of their own. Some parents are simply not in a position to give their children educationally useful activities. Now that's partly because sometimes that costs. To get the best use of the internet, for example, you need a good quality laptop or other form of electronic device, and you need broadband internet connection. Now both of these things cost money. Similarly, educationally useful trips, going on holiday to interesting places, going to theatre or cinema or museums, some museums, they cost money. Books cost money, and families that can't afford that, through no fault of their own, are unable to help their children in these ways. Similarly, to get the chance to do homework, it requires, ideally, a quiet space to study on your own, but that requires space in the house, which may not be available if you're living in very crowded accommodation. And what's more too, parents who themselves have had lots of education are better able to help their children with their education than parents who've not had that opportunity in the past, again through no fault of their own. So the key thing here is that children who lack the opportunities outside school to study well are completely dependent on the school to get access to knowledge, and therefore completely dependent on the expertise of the teachers, both the knowledge that teachers have of the content of the curriculum and also the expertise that the teachers have on how to teach well, the pedagogy in other words as well. Now that is why a knowledge-based curriculum is what you might call an emancipatory curriculum. It is a way of equalising opportunity because it gives to all children the same kind of structured opportunities that otherwise only the children of the wealthiest and best educated parents would have had in the past. By best educated, I mean those parents who have themselves gone through university or some other expensive kind of education. It's as simple as that. Now, what we know from research worldwide actually is that curricula that are based on knowledge are better able to equalise opportunities. And correspondingly, when a curriculum moves away from knowledge, it tends to widen social inequality for the reasons that I've outlined there. So the teacher is a pioneer. The teacher is a form of almost revolutionary implications for giving all children equal access to knowledge and equal access to understanding the world. That's what education should be about for everyone.
What misconceptions do teachers often have about knowledge-based curriculums, and how could you clarify them?
So there's two big misconceptions. The first one is about the false claim that knowledge is just a list of dry facts. Facts do matter, but they are only part of the thing. Far more important actually than facts are the structures of the facts, which I've been calling schemas in this conversation. Schemas are the way in which the facts fit together. So for example, let's go back to history again. We can learn dates in history, and dates do help a bit. It helps to know, for example, that Mary Queen of Scots came before Bonnie Prince Charlie, and that both of them came before the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution came before the Second World War. I mean, these are things that, unless you have a narrative, a story of history, people can get wrong. And surprisingly, people do get these kind of things wrong quite a lot. So we do have to know the facts, but the facts matter less than the structure. So why are we interested in Bonnie Prince Charlie? Why did the Jacobite Rising of 1745 matter, and then the defeat of the Jacobites in 1746? It's a great romantic story with all the pictures, we've got films, we've got music associated with that crucial event in Scottish history, but it was also a crucial event in British history and indeed in European history, because it was the final point at which the old order in Britain was defeated militarily, and in which the new order that eventually gave the Industrial Revolution and eventually further on democracy, that's where that sort of thing started. So that's why it matters. Same as if we take the Second World War. Why did it matter? It's not just about one side defeating the other. It's about the principles at stake, the question of democracy, the question of human rights, the question of genocide that emerged as one of the crucial things in the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War. That's where that concept of genocide comes from, that particular prosecution of the Nazi war criminals. These are big ideas, they're not just facts. So the key thing then is the claim that knowledge is just about facts and that facts are boring is almost a caricature of what knowledge is. Knowledge is about understanding, it's about schemas. The facts are important in underpinning the schema, in defining what the schemas are. But the facts are not the reason for doing it. The reason for doing it is an understanding. But we can't get understanding without the facts, so it's a continuous iteration between the two. So that's the first misconception. Facts, knowledge isn't just dry facts. And the second thing, another misconception, is that knowledge is only about so-called academic subjects: history, geography, mathematics, science. Now, I've talked a lot about these examples, but let me say therefore finally that this concept of knowledge is equally true of what you might call practical subjects, PE or sport, music, art, and so on. And a few examples, therefore. If you want somebody to become a good football player, for example, they've got to understand some fairly obvious facts about the rules of the game, the number of people in the teams, the size of the pitch. I mean, these are facts, but they're not all that interesting. What really matters, of course, is understanding your own body and understanding how your physical shape contributes to your capacity to play the ball well. But it also requires an understanding of psychology, because it's a team game. So you've got to understand the other 10 people in your team, but also the 11 people on the other side of the pitch. These are concepts coming from psychology, actually. So there is a physiological understanding, a set of schemas from that, and a psychological understanding as well. So let me take another example there of music. Music is a skill, so it's a very applied thing. So you might ask, where does knowledge come in here? Well, again, as with sport, there is knowledge of one's own body. If you're playing the guitar, you've got to understand how your dexterity with your fingers relates to the way in which you're going to do the fingering on the keyboard of the guitar. So some very, again, basic physiological things. But then you've also got to understand the different genres of music that you're playing. It could be, for example, classical European guitar. It could be guitar from the jazz tradition. It could be slightly differently the sitar from the Indian subcontinent traditions. So these are different styles of music. That is knowledge of what these different traditions are, but also knowledge of the typical or good examples from these different traditions. There's also got to be knowledge of how guitar playing relates to various kinds of ensemble playing in a pop group, for example, or in a different kind of ensemble, say in a European classical orchestra. So knowledge of these traditions. And then the final example I mentioned there is art. Art isn't just about self-expression, although it is of course partly about self-expression. It's also about how you express yourself. So it's partly about the science of the paper or the canvas and the paint that you're using. Nowadays it would of course be often knowledge of the digital production of images on a screen. But then you've got the question of knowledge of which tradition of art does that relate to? Is it abstract art? Is it European traditional art? Is it the art of, let us say, ancient Persian decoration? Is it the art of Islamic tiles of the North African tradition? These are pieces of knowledge that would inform your own practice as a budding artist, as a 10-year-old person wanting to make, let us say, paint ceramic tiles in the tradition of Moroccan culture. I mean, these are things which require knowledge to do well. So all of these parts of the curriculum that are sometimes called non-academic are also as firmly embedded in a structure of knowledge as mathematics or history.
What final reassurance or encouragement would you offer to primary teachers who want to make a difference in regard to their teaching of knowledge but feel constrained by time, resources, or policy demands?
A final misconception about knowledge is that it's all about a teacher standing up at the front giving a dry lecture to children of whatever age. And that is incredibly boring and off-putting and both for the children and for the teacher. It is not about that at all. It's a complete misconception to equate a particular kind of pedagogy with a particular approach to the curriculum. These are totally independent of each other. So it is quite possible to do a child-centred form of pedagogy with a very knowledge-based curriculum. Because the most effective form of pedagogy is what is sometimes called child-centred. In other words, the teacher has to continually interact with each of the children in the class as unique individuals, not as a mass of people, but with their own knowledge, their own background knowledge, their own capabilities, their own levels of boredom or otherwise, their own patience, all that kind of stuff. Now that's what child-centred pedagogy is. It's about knowing each child in your class as a unique human being. But that is a completely independent aspect of teaching, that sort of child-centred pedagogy, from what it is that you're trying to teach them. And sometimes I think the misconception arises because there is a version of that's sometimes called child-centred, which relates to the curriculum, not to how it is taught. It's about children choosing what to learn, choosing their own curriculum. Now that would be completely contrary to the whole knowledge-based principles, because children will not choose to learn the things that are necessarily worthwhile for them, because the teacher as the expert and as the adult in the room knows what the long-term best interests of the child are. So the child should not by and large be free to choose what to learn, but on the other hand, the teacher does have to concentrate on the uniqueness of each child when trying to convey the knowledge that is required. That's another reason why teaching is so difficult. So if you get 25 children in the classroom, you've got to know them all as individuals, and you've got to remember not just what they are as individuals, but because they're children, how they're changing as individuals from week to week and year to year. So a child-centred pedagogy is the only way to have an effective knowledge-centred curriculum.
Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us today. I really value your research and your expertise in this area. We might have some questions coming in on topics or points we have touched on in this episode. Would you be free to answer any of those questions in the comments?
Of course, yes. So if anybody would like to raise questions, I will look at the comments under the video and be happy to respond either in the public forum, or if you want to email me directly, email will appear in the description under the video, and please do feel free, it's a public email address, feel free to email me and I'll try to respond as helpfully as possible.
Thank you so much. Thanks again.